You're probably here because you have a fantasy draft coming up soon, and I'm here to help you out because in this video, we're talking about the 10 best picks to help you win your fantasy draft. And for what it's worth, I've helped over 10,000 people win their drafts the last few years alone, and I plan to do the same in this video for you. And I want to start with the Houston Texans, specifically their wide receivers, and I actually want to look at the guy who goes off the board last amongst their starting three receivers, Nico Collins, Stefon Diggs, and I'm looking at Tank Dell as one of the 10 best picks this year in drafts, and here's why. It was Tank Dell last year who, in his completed games, 10 of them led the Texans in targets and fantasy points, more than Nico Collins. And now, despite that fact, Tank Dell goes as the 64th overall player in drafts. He goes in the 5th or 6th round of drafts, while Nico Collins right now is going 30 picks earlier. Now, if you're not familiar too much with Tank Dell, obviously he played in those 10 completed games last year, but he's been productive at every stop of the way. You could take it back to college, where he finished his college career at the University of Houston with two 1,300 yard seasons. He ends up going in the 3rd round of the NFL draft, and then right away in the first preseason game, he pops off for a big role, and then as a rookie, he has a great season. In his rookie season, he ranked 14th in yards per out run, 18th in fantasy points per game, and he had a top 12 finish in 40% of his completed games. A stud. Now, of course, the obvious counterpoint is that, but yeah, now he has target competition. Nico Collins, who was also great last year, a top 20 receiver in efficiency, a top 15 overall wide receiver in fantasy, is still there, a top 10 receiver in fantasy. Stefon Diggs, the aging veteran, sure, but also a productive player for the past 5 to 6 to 7 years, he's now there as well. And now I do get these concerns, especially with Diggs, a target hog. If you look at his last seasons, 160, 154, 164 targets. He's now in this offense. I get that, but Diggs is also 30 plus years old, coming off of one of his worst seasons, and now has to adapt to a brand new offense, whereas Tank Dell, younger, coming back into this offense where he had success last year. Here's the thing, I'm not ready to just claim Stefon Diggs and even Nico Collins as better overall wide receivers with CJ Stroud in this offense than Tank Dell, because that wasn't the case last year. And a lot of people will point to the fact that Tank Dell is smaller, but this has really never shown up on tape. Last year, he was averaging 15.1 yards per reception, winning downfield, playing on the outside 70% of the time, top 20 basically, and downfield production last year. So I'm not really concerned with him winning or not getting a role on the outside. He's going to play on the outside in this offense. In fact, that's exactly what we saw in the first preseason game. The starters played 6 snaps here. Tank Dell played 4 of them, but these 4 snaps were on the outside. They were on the outside, and Stefon Diggs got moved into the slot. Now, here's the thing about this. You can see right here that it was Stefon Diggs and Nico Collins who played 100% of the starter snaps. You can see in this column here, and Tank Dell only got 4. So he played 4 out of the 6 in 2 wide receiver sets. It was Diggs and Collins on the field. This makes some sense, but I don't think that will be the case all year long. Again, this is just a 6 snap sample. The important part, Dell was on the outside in 3 wide receiver sets, which is something that the Houston Texans are going to primarily be using this year. So as of right now, yes, I like Tank Dell in the 5th or 6th rounds as a 3rd Texans wide receiver for a guy who's 5-6 years younger than Stefon Diggs and showed the upside last year, now going into an offense that should be taking another step forward in year 2 under CJ Stroud. One of the best picks is one Tank Dell. And another great wide receiver pick in a similar round of drafts is the #1 target for Trevor Lawrence this year, and that is Christian Kirk, who last season, this offense in Jacksonville threw at a top 10 rate, and I expect based on their offseason moves that they'll do the same this year. And believe it or not, Christian Kirk goes right now even after Tank Dell, who might be the wide receiver 1 on his team, but he also could be the wide receiver 2 or 3. Christian Kirk is the #1 receiver on his team. He's going after Tank Dell. He's going after guys like Keenan Allen, when Keenan Allen is going to have much more difficult target competition with the Bears. You can see right here, of course, DJ Moore, the #1 receiver, is there. Rome Odunze, a top 10 pick, who if by the end of the year is the #1 receiver, you wouldn't be shocked. And then you have Christian Kirk's competition, nowhere near the same. It's a rookie in Brian Thomas Jr., who had a big catch in the preseason game, but for the most part hasn't had a great camp. It hasn't been bad, but it just hasn't been spectacular. And Gabe Davis, who over the years in Buffalo, Gabe Davis really hasn't been all that great. If you were to see right here, Gabe Davis, if we scrolled through his production over the years, not the most athletic player, he was never able to top 100 targets with Josh Allen in that offense, and that's what Stefon Diggs taking a lot of attention. Never was a consistent producer downfield. This is not a guy that I think is going to threaten Christian Kirk's role. Now, I wouldn't be shocked if the rookie Brian Thomas did threaten this role. He's a unique player. He's 6'3", 209 pounds. You can see right here on Player Profiler. Then you go over to his athletic testing, 4.33 speed, right? This is a guy that in college, he kind of just won with this speed downfield. He has long strides to get by defenders. That's what he somewhat did in the preseason game with a 41-yard reception, but he also came back to the ball. His ball tracking looked pretty good there. Not shocked if he sees a big role, but still, I think Christian Kirk is the security blanket in this offense. And if you look at a lot of the underlying stats for Christian Kirk, this is a guy who has been productive. He's been a top 20 efficiency receiver the last 2 years. He's been targeted on 3rd downs and 4 first downs, often by Trevor Lawrence. Last year, he was 33rd in fantasy points per game, but this is skewed because he left a couple of games early and only scored 3 touchdowns, which was a career low. But if you factor in all of this and the fact that now Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones are gone, you're going to see an uptick this year in terms of priority in the offense for Christian Kirk. Now, in the preseason game, you can see right here, it was Brian Thomas. So this is the 9 snaps with the starters. Brian Thomas Thomas and Gabe Davis played those 9 snaps. Christian Kirk only played 7. So some people are concerned that Christian Kirk is not going to be on the field in 2 wide receiver sets, since in this game that was Thomas and Gabe Davis. But here's the thing. We saw this happen last year. Christian Kirk was only used in the preseason in the slot. Regular season started, and he's a starter in 2 wide receiver sets. I think the Jaguars are just trying to see Brian Thomas out there for more reps, and that's what's happening here, but we'll track this. And if we look at the offseason moves here, obviously we mentioned Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones, the receivers, are gone. They brought back in Gabe Davis. They ended up signing or drafting Brian Thomas and some free agents. I believe based on all the offseason moves of not really signing a new running back in free agency, of only drafting a late round running back, on the offensive line being a little bit sketchy when it comes to run blocking, this team is still going to be throwing at a top 10 rate, which obviously helps their potential number 1 receiver, Christian Kirk. He's one of the best picks in fantasy. And perhaps my favorite overall pick in fantasy drafts right now, the most mispriced player who goes in round 7 or 8 of drafts, is Jaylen Warren, the Pittsburgh Steelers running back. And here's the deal with Warren. This is a guy, I've said it before, this guy last year ended up finishing as a top 30 running back. He put up over 1,200 yards while playing less than 50% of the snaps. While being a backup or in a split backfield, he put up one of the most productive fantasy seasons on a per touch basis last year. And here's the deal. Yeah, he finished as the running back 29 on that 50% snap share, only scored 4 touchdowns. I think that's going to go up this year, in which should be a very run heavy offense. And believe it or not, the situation for him has actually gotten better this year, despite Najee Harris still being there. And you might be saying, how could that possibly be, Sal? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because yes, Najee Harris is still there. And for the most part, he had a pretty solid season last year. He's entering the final year of his deal. They did not pick up his 50-year option, so you can make of that of what you would right now. But in general, it seems like Jaylen Warren is going to see more investment in terms of just overall touches this year, with Najee Harris leaving next year. There's kind of just some of the camp reports coming out right now in terms of a bigger role for Jaylen Warren, especially on third downs, especially in this new Arthur Smith offense. More on that in a second. But even outside of Najee Harris, even if it was the same exact role, which I don't think it's going to be, the offensive line got better. They spent their first 2 draft picks on Troy Fautanu, a guard, and Zach Frazier, a center. They also spent the 4th round pick on Mason McCormick. This was already a borderline top 12 unit last year. In my opinion, they're a pretty clear top 10 unit entering this season on the offensive line. And the team, like I said, also signed Arthur Smith to be the new offensive coordinator. And for the past 4 straight seasons, he's led his offenses with the Titans 2 years and the Falcons 2 years to being top 10 rush offenses. And this is a guy in Arthur Smith who used multiple backs during those seasons, whether it was in Tennessee or whether it was as recent as last year with Tyler Algier and Bijan. Both those guys were seeing 12 plus touches a game. I think Jaylen Warren can easily slide into that and more this year. Now, in the first preseason game, we didn't really get a lot of information here. The starters did play 17 reps, so that's important to note. Russell Wilson was injured for this game, so Justin Fields started here. And you can see Najee Harris saw 9 snaps. Jaylen Warren saw 8 snaps. So it's basically similar to last year, 50-50 split or so. Not a lot that we can gather from this. Jaylen Warren was used on those passing downs. They split the early down usage, so it's kind of similar to last year, but again, small sample of just 9 snaps. But the fact is, Jaylen Warren was able to be productive and efficient on 12 touches last year. Why can't he do that on 15 to 16 per game this year? Warren ranked top 10 in explosive run rate, broken tackle rate, and yards per touch last season. I think he's worthy of a top 24 running back pick in drafts this year. He goes after that right now, even if his role didn't change. But entering year 3 after how good he was last year, I think it's going to improve even more. But the crazy thing is, despite this, he goes in end drafts after guys like Zach Moss, who are nowhere near as efficient, productive, especially as pass catchers or in terms of explosive runs. And Zach Moss might be losing his job right now actually in camp to Chase Brown, maybe more on that later. It's just crazy that he's going after guys like this. Even Tony Pollard in a 50-50 backfield where he hasn't been as explosive. I think Pollard's a fine pick, but Jaylen Warren is somebody who just stands out to me as a clear top 24 running back, not being drafted like that right now. And I also think it's worth thinking about what happens if Najee Harris misses time, because he hasn't missed time these last 2 years as Jaylen Warren has been on the team. If Najee, as an aging running back who's seen a lot of carries, just misses 1, 2, even 3 games, Jaylen Warren becomes a top 10 running back for those weeks in fantasy, and obviously that boosts his stock where you get him right now. He has a ton of upside if something was to happen to Najee. Now, this next running back is probably the latest you can get a starting running back in fantasy drafts, and he's actually in a good offense. But before we get there, I do want to let you know about the Fantasy Blueprint that over 12,000 and close to now 15,000 people are currently using to help them with their drafts and win their league all season long. There'll be a link below in the description, but check it out right here. You can actually get the Blueprint this year risk-free through 2 of our partners. They're linked right here. You can see there's going to be instructions on how to get them. And how is it risk-free? Well, pretty simple. If you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I refund your one-time payment of $10. It's not per month. It's not per week. It's just for the entire year, $10 if you go through our partners. You don't make the playoffs, you get that right back. It's not just for your draft. I send you tools every single day during the season as well. Waivers, rankings, matchup notes, all this stuff. So if you want to get access to your Fantasy Blueprint today, it's the tools that I use and nearly 15,000 others are currently using. Might be some of your league mates, so you might just have to get it to keep up with them. You can scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. Now, that running back who goes super late right now and is a starting running back is actually for the Dallas Cowboys, Rico Dowdle. He currently goes, he's rising up draft boards a little bit, but he goes in round 12 or 13 of a lot of drafts. Even if he's going in like round 10 or 11, I still think he's a solid pick. Because all the reports out of camp right now, and this is an article via The Athletic that recently dropped, Rico Dowdle has to be the favorite to lead the Cowboys in rushing this year. There's been a lot of reports also that based on since they've been putting pads on these last couple of weeks in camp that he looks like the clear best running back compared to veterans like Royce Freeman, who's dealing with an injury, second-year running back Deuce Vaughn, who's dealing with an injury, and the aging veteran who's now back in Ezekiel Elliott. Now, some people might have been concerned seeing in the first preseason game that Rico Dowdle ended up playing 6 snaps and the starters didn't go on the field, but there's a reason for this. Basically, all those other guys, like I mentioned, Deuce Vaughn and Royce Freeman were hurt, they couldn't play, and Ezekiel Elliott was dealing with something minor and they just didn't kind of want to risk it. They just needed bodies. They didn't have running backs out there, so they put him out there for 6 snaps. He came out. Don't read too much into that. Now, you might be wondering who Rico Dowdle is. Well, he's still just 26 years old, and he's actually been on the Cowboys his entire career. He's a guy who has some nice size here at 213 pounds if you're trying to think about what he could do in the red zone, but the big concern for him is in his 3 seasons with the Cowboys, he's never had a 100 carry season. He's never started an NFL game. Last year was his most usage, and he was pretty good on this usage, around the top 20 running back in efficiency, but all he had was 89 carries, and he added 17 receptions, so barely over 100 total touches. He's somewhat inexperienced. But like I said, those 106 total touches last year, he actually was productive. He ranked 23rd in yards per touch and top 20 in broken tackle rate, and this was much better than his new running mate Ezekiel Elliott had done last year in terms of those numbers with the Patriots. And this offseason, the reason why Rico Dowdle is kind of in the picture right now is because the team didn't draft any running backs, which was kind of a shocker that they didn't add at least one, especially later in the draft. And right after the draft, they re-signed veteran Ezekiel Elliott to come back to the team. Maybe they'll trust him more on third downs or in passing situations, so we'll have to see there. But as of that, nothing changed. They actually added a tackle in Tyler Guyton, who in the first preseason game looked pretty good. They're going to need to kind of have a good offensive line in some of these rookies they had, because you can see right here, they lost center Tyler Bidasz. They lost Lyle Collins. They lost Tyron Smith. They lost a lot of pieces on their offensive line. So yeah, this Guyton guy having a good first game in the preseason, first round pick, that's important. Now, as I said, Zeke wasn't great last year, but look, he's a veteran, and this is a guy that Jerry Jones trusts, and the offense is probably going to trust in general when it comes to key situations, pass protection for Dak in the red zone. Now, Rico Dowdle can definitely win those if he can show that he can consistently do it, but if you're talking about a guy like Mike McCarthy, he might just trust the veteran to start the season more in those situations. Dowdle might have to prove it, but after that, Deuce Vaughn, a smaller running back dealing with injury, Royce Freeman, kind of a cut candidate, older running back dealing with injury. These guys are not threats to really take much from Rico Dowdle. At the very worst, Dowdle's going to see more than the 20% of the snaps he saw last year. Even if it's a 50-50 split with Ezekiel Elliott, in round 12 or 13, in this offense as the more productive and younger and explosive back, Dowdle is interesting. Because last year, Tony Pollard, these are his numbers, had over 1,000 rushing yards. He was inefficient last year, Pollard, dealing with an ankle injury that he had surgery on in the offseason, and 300 rushing yards. So Pollard had over 1,300 yards last year in this offense. If Dowdle has anywhere near that, heck, if he has just 75% of that, he is going to be a smash home run pick in fantasy drafts in like round after 10, whatever you get him at. But right now, 12 in drafts is where he's going. Now, if Dowdle is the latest you can get a starting running back, maybe the latest you can get the number 1 receiver on a team is right here with Josh Palmer, who goes outside the top 150 picks in round 13. He is on the Los Angeles Chargers and does have an opportunity to be their number 1 pick. Number 1 pick, I meant number 1 receiver there. And of course, there's other guys in this wide receiver core. There's the rookie Ladd McConkey, who works in the slot and out wide, getting rave reviews. Second round pick they traded up for. I think Ladd McConkey is great as well. But McConkey's already going in like round 6 or 7 of fantasy drafts, and this team is going to throw at least 500 times this year, more than likely. So there's going to be multiple guys who can benefit. And why not Josh Palmer be one of those guys? This is a guy who's now entering, if you scroll down here, his 4th season with Justin Herbert. And when he's had opportunities, he's had pretty decent seasons. Now you could see just 49 targets, 107 and 61 targets. You might not be jumping up and down because of that, but keep in mind, this team no longer has Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Gerald Everett, their starting tight end the last few years, and Austin Eckler. All those guys Josh Palmer was competing with the last couple of years, they're all gone. This gives him an opportunity to be a top 2, if not number 1 receiver for Justin Herbert, but keep this in mind. Herbert injured his foot and is expected to play week 1, but he's dealing with a plantar fascia issue. Now, this can be very complicated or it can be very minor. Plantar fascia issues, if it's like any type of a tear, if it's an aggravation, it might last a couple of days to a couple of weeks. If it's any type of tear or anything like that, this can linger all season long. So we need more information on this. It's kind of sketchy. But as of right now, let's just assume that he will in fact play week 1, like the reports are saying that they expect him to. Well, now there's 254 vacated targets available with all those other guys, Eckler, Williams, Keenan Allen, gone. So Palmer might step into those, and let's break it down some more. Because I've been on record saying Palmer isn't the greatest wide receiver. He's finished as the wide receiver 42 and wide receiver 44 the last 2 seasons while competing with all those guys. But I think he's definitely a fine wide receiver who has a little bit of upside. And despite actually finishing as like a top 40 receiver these last 2 years, he now goes as the wide receiver 59 in drafts, even though all those other guys are gone. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And I know a lot of people will say the Chargers are going to run a lot this year. They have Greg Roman, their offensive coordinator now. They have Jim Harbaugh. Those guys love to run the ball. Yeah, they're going to run a lot, but they're still going to have to throw like 30 times a game at least. Because that's just the NFL we're in today. These are the lowest passing teams last year. The Titans threw 29 times per game. Baltimore threw 29 times per game. And I don't think that the Chargers are going to be leading in games like Baltimore was last year. San Fran, same thing. They threw 30 times per game. Like, at least you're going to throw 30 times per game. The Chargers are actually projected for the 20th most points this year. So I'd be saying that they're probably going to throw 32 to 34 to 35 times per game. And if that's the case, even if Ladd McConkey in his rookie year was to earn 120 targets, which would be a massive rookie year and rookie season, Josh Palmer can still himself also earn 120 targets. And if he's going in round 13, that is valuable, even if he's not scoring touchdowns. But imagine he has like a nice touchdown year of just 5 or 6 touchdowns. Easily he's going to finish around the top 36 wide receiver. And I'm not really sure how we can be worried about his other competition. Quentin Johnson right now is reportedly a backup based on camp reports and his preseason usage behind DJ Shark, who's a newcomer and a fine player, probably a play the X. Deeper league, sure, you could look at him, but I'm not too concerned about him consistently being out there in 2 wide receiver sets like a Josh Palmer and the rookie Ladd McConkey should. And the nice thing is we have a little bit of a sample with Palmer. He started 11 games without Keenan Allen in the past couple of 3 seasons with the Chargers, and he averages 12.5 points per game and 7.6 targets per game. 7.6 targets per game is right around top 30 wide receiver usage. 12.5 points per game is right around top 36. Again, Palmer now goes as wide receiver 59. This is an insane value. I understand, like we said earlier, with Jim Harbaugh now being the coach, a run-first coach during his time at San Francisco, and last year running 37 times per game in college with Michigan, of course, a different league and all that, and just in general, a different way they play the game. And then the offensive coordinator, Greg Roman, has always ranked top 10 in run rate as a coach since he's been an offensive coordinator. So I get that these are concerns, but it's not like these two guys, when they were together with the 49ers, didn't have a number 1 receiver that they targeted a lot. In 2012, Michael Crabtree had 146 targets. In 2013, Anquan Boldin had 150 targets. And in 2014, they both had over 100 targets. And now this offense is going to be more pass happy just because that's how the league has moved. It's not Colin Kaepernick, a mobile quarterback behind center. It's Justin Herbert, who has a big arm and he's actually more efficient. So I think that this is a nice opportunity. I think Palmer sees at least 120 targets this year. And even if Ladd McConkey breaks out, that still makes Palmer a great round 13 option with even more upside if McConkey doesn't break out. All right, next up, let's go to one of the best picks you can get in all fantasy drafts because he somehow goes, even though he's going mainstream, Malik Neighbors, the rookie wide receiver for the Giants, their number 1 receiver. He's going mainstream right now. It's a big New York media. There's a lot of reports. He's still going in round 4 or 5 of drafts. And this right here, the fact that he recently had this ankle injury that as of this recording, it is expected to be minor with no fractures. And if it's a minor ankle injury, that means, a week or 2 tops. This is probably going to keep some people from drafting him. So you can still get him as a 4th or 5th round pick. I think he's a borderline top 24 overall player this year. I don't have to draft him in the 2nd round, but I definitely will in round 4 or round 5. And it's been just the entire offseason right now. You can see he was dominating camp reports. Okay, against his own secondary, that's not supposed to be that good. But then he goes up against a Lions secondary that added some pieces, and he's just been absolutely, you can see it here. He dominated the Giants cornerbacks daily. And then this week, the challenge became the Detroit Lions joint practices, and he proved that his success against his teammates wasn't a fluke. Those teammates in the Giants secondary, not as great, as he routinely torched the Lions cornerbacks in their 2 practices together. Okay, so this is great. And then we go into the first preseason game, and the limited snaps that the starters played, 12 snaps, you get Malik Neighbors playing 12 of the 13 starter snaps, running every single route, all 8 routes, operating as the number 1 receiver, playing 92% of the snaps. Then it comes out after that game that he had a little bit of this ankle injury. So now my guess is he'll be shut down the rest of the preseason, but we've seen everything we needed to. Hopefully this kind of cools off some of that heat that he had in camp. The fact that he's dealing with an injury means he won't be in camp in the preseason, so we'll see less highlights, which means other players' highlights will pop up and your league mates will want to take them instead. Hopefully that's the goal. Fingers crossed. Now, as for Malik Neighbors' competition, this is the reason why I think that he could see 150 target season. I mean, you're talking about Wan'Dale Robinson as a starter, a short area guy. Jalen Hyatt isn't even a starter right now in camp. He's a deep threat guy. And then Darius Slayton is a starter, but this is a guy approaching 30 years old. We know what he is at this point. Kind of an inconsistent X receiver who can win in the intermediate parts of the field. But when you're talking about Malik Neighbors, top 10 overall pick, comes out with comparisons to guys like Amari Cooper. This is a guy who can break fantasy or at least have massive upside. He's going to be featured in this offense. It also helps that his head coach is Brian Daboll, and Brian Daboll loves to feature a number 1 receiver. He hasn't had that in his time with the Giants, but now he does. During his time in Buffalo, he featured Stephon Diggs for 150 plus targets a season, like we showed you earlier at the beginning of the video, looking at Diggs' past years, 150, 160 target years in Buffalo. Now, if you're not familiar with Malik Neighbors for any reason, let me just give you a quick rundown on what he did. Last year at LSU, he was absolutely fantastic. He had over 1,500 total yards while competing against some of the top defensive backs in the nation in the SEC and battling another first-round rookie that went in this year's draft in Brian Thomas Jr., his teammate from LSU. And Neighbors himself is extremely athletic. He compares, like I said, to Amari Cooper, guys like AJ Green. He ran at his pro day in the low 4.3s despite being a somewhat bigger wide receiver who wins after the catch. Pretty nice profile. I mean, simply put, when I'm in round 4, round 5 of my drafts, I usually just take him in round 4. So the fact that if he ends up losing or going after that, I would just be kicking myself. Currently, you get right now Marvin Harrison Jr., the other rookie that went in this draft, going in round 2. These guys are pretty comparable players. I get the quarterback situations might be slightly different, but that's massively baked into Malik Neighbors' price tag now as a 4th or a 5th round pick. Maybe the best wide receiver in drafts right now. And a guy who's rising up the rankings and has become a top 10 pick overall in fantasy for me right now is Chase Brown, who quietly is becoming maybe the running back 1 in Bengals camp. It's not locked up just yet, but let's break it down. Every single day we're getting positive news about Chase Brown, and when they ask about the other running back in this backfield, the veteran Zach Moss, they're just like, yeah, he's like, he can pass protect. Yeah, he looks okay. Like, there's nothing exciting there. Then Chase Brown goes out with the starters and he plays plays all 13 snaps, 100% of the snaps. He's on the field in all situations, on the early downs, in the passing downs, in pass protection spots. Now, for this game, Zach Moss did not play because they said he was dealing with something, so maybe Brown would have been filtered in. We could have got a better idea. We'll see that in future games, but it was encouraging to see that usage here. This is via PFF, by the way, that Brown did play all 13 snaps. They did see him out there in pass protection, and they trusted him in those situations to protect Joe Burrow, who is coming off of wrist surgery. Now, we already know that Chase Brown is the younger, more explosive and dynamic back compared to one Zach Moss. You just saw that last year alone in their samples that they had on the field. And then we get Zach Taylor coming in here and saying that his favorite thing he's seen from Chase Brown in camp is consistency when it comes to pass protection. He would go on to add that he's done everything, Chase Brown, that the coaches have asked of him. So this is positive news, which is why when you see reports like this, Zach Moss listed ahead of Chase Brown on the depth chart, keep in mind it's an unofficial depth chart, and these things don't matter at all because we have an entire camp and preseason that we can actually get real data from, not just this beginning of camp unofficial depth chart. No, because those things like Chase Brown seeing pass protection usage getting talked up in camp compared to Zach Moss, those things matter more than an unofficial depth chart at the start of camp. Now, obviously, Joe Mixon is no longer with this team. If you're not familiar, well, there you go. You just got it. He's on the Texans now. So the team did sign Zach Moss this offseason, but they only gave him like $3 million a year. None of that's even fully guaranteed. It's kind of just being paid like low-tier starter, but mostly backup money. So the incentive, if you're talking about money-wise, the fact that they gave him a contract, Zach Moss, is not going to keep him over the field over one Chase Brown, who, like we have already mentioned, has the nice size of 209 pounds, has the elite athleticism, ran in the 4.4s last year at the NFL Combine, and then in flashes showed success as a rookie. Now, most of that success came as a pass catcher. If we scroll down here on Player Profile, you can see he averaged 5.8 yards per touch, but this is because he had a couple of big receptions. He was only averaging 3.8 yards per carry. But keep in mind, this was on a team that had an injured offensive line last year. He was a rookie, Chase Brown. He's improved since then, apparently, and only had 44 carries. So we can't be kind of knocking it against him when he had 44 carries. 8 of them were in the red zone. Some of these are around the goal line, so you can't even get big runs, right? The most you can get if you're on the 3-yard line is 3 yards. So I'm not really going to hold that 44 touch sample against him last year. So right now, I think Chase Brown is in an interesting spot as a 10th round pick. You can see they also improved their offensive line by getting Trent Brown. He's kind of a hit or miss player, but when he hits, he's one of the best in the league at tackle. They also added Amarius Mims, who's currently dealing with an injury, but he's one of the biggest and best run blockers in the entire NFL draft. First round pick when he's out there and healthy should improve this offensive line that last year was a little bit hit or miss due to injuries. We're hoping now they could be around league average or better. That's all you need for your fantasy running back to find success. Next up, I want to talk about the best quarterback pick in drafts, and this one might seem crazy because, yeah, he's the number one quarterback for a lot of people, or he's up there with guys like Lamar Jackson, Mahomes, and Josh Allen, but it's Jalen Hurts for me because how is it hard, or how is he not the number one guy, right? Because right here you can see the last 2 seasons, he was the number 1 and number 2 guy. Last year, he was number 1 with a bullet until the second half of the year when he ended up dealing with not just one, but like 2 or 3, 4 different injuries, and he still finished as the number 2 option, largely because of what he can do on the ground. 760 rushing yards, more importantly, 13 rushing touchdowns, and then 15 rushing touchdowns last year. We can't rely on that every year, but it's been a pretty consistent thing. 10 plus rushing touchdowns every year. We can kind of rely on that as long as Hurts is healthy. Now, last season, you had to take Jalen Hurts in like the second round. Now he goes as the 32nd overall pick. So you actually get him a round later, despite the fact that he actually was productive last year. And sometimes I've even seen him fall to like the 3-4 turn, and people get him at the beginning of the 4th round. And for the most part, what has changed since last year, besides the fact that he's gotten healthier? Well, I could actually think of a couple things, but they actually benefit this guy. For starters, the Eagles have a new offensive coordinator, and this is going to be a big upgrade. Their one last year, and Brian Johnson wasn't all that great. They have a new one in Kellen Moore. And apparently all the reports out of camp is that right now in this new offense, it's probably the best Jalen Hurts has looked in 5 years. They're saying that he looks comfortable in the Kellen Moore system, a system that should involve more plays, a faster pace of play, pre-snap motion. All these things make an offense more efficient and get more plays out, which helps Jalen Hurts. Now, another thing that has changed is that Jason Kelce, a Hall of Fame center, has retired, or future Hall of Fame center has retired. So obviously that's not the greatest of news, but it's not going to change this offensive line. PFF still has him as the number 2 offensive line entering the year because they have a great center still to replace him that Kelce handpicked a couple years ago in the draft in Cam Jurgens. And the rest of this offensive line is bulletproof. It's great. So I'm not really seeing a concern here in terms of a drop-off in their offensive line play. And another thing that didn't change, and this is a good thing for one Jalen Hurts, is that he still has his 2 alpha receivers there, right? You still have A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. If anything, you might have a new wide receiver 3 in Johnny Wilson getting a lot of hype in camp. This 230, 40-pound wide receiver playing out of the slot might even give them a more efficient look in the red zone with a monster like that on the field next to one A.J. Brown. And something people always underlook is that the fact that your division, you play them twice a year. So how good are those defenses? Well, for Philadelphia, they'll be playing the Giants and the Commanders, who have bottom 5 secondaries entering the year. And even more important, Philadelphia's secondary is also also not that great. Their front is good, but their secondary is also 24th in the NFL according to PFF. So if they're going to be facing a lot of teams in their division with bad secondaries, and their secondary, as you can see right here, 24th in the league, at least on paper to enter the year, isn't great, it could lead to some shootouts, which again is only going to fuel bigger performances for a guy like Hurts. So when I'm in round 3 of my fantasy drafts, I love starting a draft with maybe like an anchor running back in round 1, getting a stud wide receiver in round 2, and then if Jalen Hurts is there in round 3, I feel amazing about those starts. Now, before we get into who I believe is the best tight end right now in fantasy drafts and another stud receiver, I want to let you know that right now, 68% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed. I just want to say, hey, hit the subscribe button. A lot of you are new here. These videos are popping up during fantasy season. It's a little nudge to hit that button. I want to get as close to 50% as we can before week 1. It's a goal of mine, and it really helps the channel more than you could possibly know. So here's your urge. Hit that subscribe button. Now, I mentioned that tight end who might be the best value in all of drafts right now. And I want to show you, there's a lot of good guys. If you're looking in terms of like round 5 through 10, you have Dalton Kincaid pops up. You have Kyle Pitts, maybe a breakout season. Evan Ingram led all tight ends in receptions and targets last year. Even guys like David Njoku are a solid value. Pat Freiermuth, right? All these guys are nice options, but I also like quarterbacks. I like receivers. I like running backs in those same ranges of the draft. But what if I told you can find a starting tight end with a ton of upside, elite athlete, has had top 12 finishes in the past as recent as a few years ago? You could actually find him in like the 16th round of the drafts. You'd be like, oh no, you're crazy. Well, no, look right here. Noah Fant goes as the tight end 24, 192nd overall. This is the best tight end in all fantasy drafts right now if you could actually land him. And I know the first thing that you're going to be saying, Sal, did you see what this guy did last year? I did. I actually pulled it up right here on Player Profile. I knew you would ask, right? Hey, look, this guy was 36th amongst tight ends last year, just 4.3 points per game, 0 touchdowns scored. This is the guy you want me to be drafting? Well, it would be smart of you to kind of point that out and see how bad he was last year and bring up the question. I appreciate that, but I want to add some context because this is nowhere near the same Seahawks offense as last year or the same competition for Noah Fant. For starters, his biggest competition last year was Colby Parkinson and Will Dissly. Both of those veteran tight ends are now gone. They were rotating with Noah Fant, 3 tight ends last year. They're gone, and they weren't replaced. The only tight end brought in, AJ Barner, a middle round to late round rookie, does not really seem to profile out to be a threat in year 1, which means Noah Fant is going to see the workhorse tight end usage, if you will, entering this year, which is important because this is a brand new offense that's going to throw more. Because their new offensive coordinator is Ryan Grubb. We've talked a lot about him on this channel. He comes over from Washington. He had a top 5 offense at Washington last year because he utilized 3 wide receiver sets and passing the ball a lot. So when you look at Noah Fant, a guy that I mentioned has had top 12 tight end finishes earlier in his career, tight end 12, tight end 11. Then he starts to split rotations with 3 tight ends in Seattle and goes to the tight end 23 and 36. I'm expecting him to get back to that full-time usage here and be a top 12 to top 11 to top 10 tight end that you get as the tight end 24 off the board. Because last year, Fant ranked 33rd in tight end snap share, and there's a good chance entering this season that can go into the top 10, which is going to lead to a much bigger season. Now for the next guy who's one of the 10 best picks in all fantasy drafts, and I got to talk about this guy. It's Drake London, because as of right now, some people might be scared if we look over here on Fantasy Pros. His ADP is 22nd overall. He goes as a 2nd round pick. Yes, I get that. I understand all of that, but he is worth it. And you might be saying, but Sally's only finishes the 43rd and 42nd wide receiver in fantasy the last 2 seasons. Isn't that bad? Well, I would tell you, hey, that's actually improvement. He went from 43rd to 42nd. I mean, I'm just kidding here. Let's give you the real context. That's why I'm not worried about these last 2 seasons. Because if you actually watch the tape, you can see that London was good out there, and it was his quarterbacks and Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke that were just so inaccurate and couldn't hit him on a low offense passing team. But this big guy, 213 pounds, 6'4", is now going to be in a much improved offense with the best quarterback of his life in Kirk Cousins. He's going to see a lot more red zone opportunities and just a lot more targets in general. Because that new offense is going to be led by new play caller Zach Robinson, who in the first preseason game, actually, he comes over from the Rams, a team that leads the NFL in 3 wide receiver sets and passing volume. He came over, and in the first preseason game, he did exactly that. He played 3 wide receiver sets and passed the ball a ton. Here's actually those exact breakdowns. Again, this is via PFF right here. Zach Robinson came over from the Rams, who used 11 personnel 95% of the time. You can see right here, 94.7% of the time last season. That led the NFL. And then in Friday's preseason game, Robinson used it 95.6% of the time, compared to last year the Falcons, who used a league low 17.1% rate. Now, these are a lot of numbers, but here's the thing. It means that he just showed that he can go from being dead last to Falcons last year in 3 wide receiver sets and pass rate to maybe number 1 or up there with number 1 in the NFL. That's obviously going to change the entire outlook for this offense and their number 1 receiver, Drake London. And for what it's worth, his new quarterback is Kirk Cousins, who was leading the league in passing last year before injury and passing yards and efficiency, and now he's coming into And for what it's worth, his new quarterback is Kirk Cousins, who loves to pass the ball. He was leading the NFL in passing yards before injury last year. And all of Kirk Cousins' wide receivers, the last 7 years, on average, I should say, have finished as a top 10 wide receiver. And that's not just Justin Jefferson. You have guys like Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs also in there. And Drake London is a talented player. I think he's going to be the next guy to have a top 10 finish with Kirk Cousins. These have been the 10 best picks in all of your fantasy drafts. It's going to help you win your league. But if you want the complete guide to the running back position, I ranked the top 40 running backs this year in fantasy, one by one in order, with tiers as well, so you know exactly who the best guys are in this video right here. So make sure you check that out before you draft and even after, just so you can kind of get an idea, because this is very, very important. It's a guide to the running back position.